the end of the Cold War to identify the return of great power rivalry as a central feature of global geopolitics. Prior to her most recent government service, Dr. Schadlow served as a senior program officer at the Smith Richardson Foundation, where she focused on cultivating and investing in research and policy solutions to improve the security and strategic competitiveness of the United States. Her book, which is excellent, by the way, War and the Art of Governance, was named to the 2020 U.S. Special Operations Command Commander's Reading List, and more importantly, has the distinction of being on my general exam reading list. So all of my advisees get to read it as well.
And cites you, I think, Pete, as well.
There you go.
More important.
Her writings have also appeared in Foreign Affairs, The Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, The Hill, The Washington Examiner, and other publications. She is currently a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a visiting fellow at MITRE. A little bit of admin. If you want to ask a question, do so please via the chat function. And I will, or actually, better yet, do it via the Q&A function so that if you want to chat with each other, the questions won't get hidden in the chat. So please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. And you don't have to wait for the end of Dr. Schadlow's remarks to ask your questions. You can just send them in as they occur to you. And then I will host the Q&A session when Nadia is done with her remarks. So welcome, Nadia, to the Mershon Center, the virtual Mershon Center for International Security Studies, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pete. It's really a pleasure to be here. Of course, it would be nicer if I could actually be there, but it's nice to at least have this interaction, and I look forward to it and to catching up with you and your students and others. So I'll begin today. The title of my talk is, as asked, the NSS National Security Strategy of 2017 and the Future of American Grand Strategy. Over 20 years ago, the scholar and strategist, Dr. Richard Betts, who many of you may know or have read about, wrote what would become a seminal article for the journal International Security. It was called, Is Strategy an Illusion? And it questioned whether strategy was possible in a democracy, given the political push and pull, the contentiousness, and the compromises required. When he wrote the article, Betts wanted to explore why the very notion of strategy had come into question. Strategy, he believed, meant the ability to exercise some degree of reflection and choice in international politics and warfare. Strategy sought to bring about a rational relationship between the exercise of power, especially military power, and political objectives. Strategy, however imperfect, allowed for the use of force as a policy instrument, because to deploy military forces without strategy was tantamount to killing without purpose. Yet, critics of strategy were growing. They argued that strategy, especially grand strategy, bore little relationship to the way that decisions were actually made. In the real world, they argued, proper coordination of domestic and international policies was all but impossible. Leaders are not visionaries, and they never maintain a steady course toward crisply defined goals. More often, leaders tinker with the status quo, experiment, and lurch from crisis to crisis. The purpose of Betts's essay, then, was to salvage the practice of strategy against the cumulative weight of its many critics. Betts focused on a narrower definition of strategy than will be the subject of this talk. He defined strategy as a plan for using military means to achieve political ends. His was a very Clausewitzian framework, the use of engagements for the object of war. But he also acknowledged that strategy existed on different levels. He described strategies as chains of relationships among means and ends that span several levels, from maneuvers of units and specific engagements, to larger campaigns, to wars, to grand strategies and foreign policies. So it is about this part of strategy at the national level or at the level of grand strategy that I will talk about this afternoon. I intend to cover three areas. First, the content and the drafting process of the 2017 National Security Strategy, which I'll refer to as the NSS. Second, a bit about its implementation. And finally, I'll offer some thoughts about where I think American grand strategy is going, or what the NSS means for American grand strategy going forward. So I'll begin my talk on a gray day in March of 2017, when I walked into the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, known as the EEOB. Everything in Washington has an acronym. The EEOB sits adjacent to the West Wing of the White House. My office would be one of about 550 in that old executive office building, which happens to be a National Historic Landmark that was built between 1871 and 1888. Yes, it took about 15 years to build. I confess I was later puzzled to learn that Mark Twain had called it the ugliest building in America, and President Truman would agree, citing it as the greatest monstrosity in the country. Wow, I had actually thought it was a pretty nice looking place. But on that day and in many subsequent days, Professor Betts's question loomed large in my mind. Was strategy even possible? I'd been tapped to lead the drafting of the strategy by President Trump's second national security advisor, General H.R. McMaster, who Pete mentioned. So Betts's question was quite real to me. It was not the question of a professor asking his students, but it was one that a policy practitioner would need to answer. Why? Because in 1986, with the Goldwater-Nichols Act, again, many of you are probably familiar with that, Congress required that a new administration communicate its national security vision to the Congress, but also to the American people. When I arrived, 16 previous strategies had been produced. The National Security Strategy of 2017 happened coincidentally to be the 17th. The Eisenhower Executive Office Building was a place where many strategies had to varying degrees been crafted by previous inhabitants. It had at one time housed the Departments of State, of War, and of the Navy, which is pretty remarkable to think of 3 departments in one building, given government today. But there were no clear sets of instructions for producing a strategy, no set templates, no approaches, or set approaches. Indeed, there are no perfect apprenticeships in crafting strategy. It's not a calibrated set of building blocks, such as those that are put together in the professional military education, for instance, of a military officer, when he or she moves from captain to major to eventually colonel or general officer. Strategy is not a pure science. Bernard Brodie, the American nuclear theorist, reminded us that strategy is like other branches of politics and other applied sciences. It's not a pure science because it deals with human beings who act and react and have will and aspirations. Indeed, in his 1959 Naval War College Review article, Bernard Brodie noted that Clausewitz had been criticized for not offering readers and practitioners a system of strategy, for not offering a system of rules that would guarantee success. Instead, in a way, the building blocks of strategy are those that are taught at the Mershon Center, a place that offers an education to understand politics, to understand international relations, strategic theory, and history. Most importantly, perhaps, at the Mershon Center, you're interdisciplinary in focus, and strategy is indeed very interdisciplinary in nature. They're interdisciplinary in their breadths, especially national strategies, because they focus not just on one interest, but on intertwined political, military, and economic interests. And they're interdisciplinary in their means, because a national security strategy must also identify the range of tools necessary to protect and advance US interests. So Mershon's approach is grounded in an understanding of the art, not the science of strategy making. This interdisciplinary imperative was front and center for me in March of 2017. In just 9 months, we would need to deliver a strategy that explained to the American people the kinds of challenges and opportunities facing the United States, and a strategy that would catalyze new policy actions to meet those challenges and opportunities. The first step in any strategy is to identify the problems at hand. And so to do so, our team, a small team of 4, had to identify clearly the strategic shifts taking place in the world. It had to capture the geopolitical landscape in which the United States was operating, the problems and opportunities afforded by that landscape, and it had to set a direction going forward. It needed to do this quickly with a small staff, as I mentioned, and in the middle of what was, to say the least, a pretty contentious political environment. Really, it remained a contentious political environment. While 9 months might seem like a long time to those in the business world, in government, where everything works very ponderously and slowly, it's more like 9 seconds. The NSS diagnosed the challenges facing the United States in a different way than in the past, and it was a diagnosis that would set the stage for many of the policy shifts that we would subsequently see, and which I would argue we're still seeing. It explained that following the remarkable victory of free nations in the Cold War, America emerged as the lone superpower with enormous advantages. Success, however, had bred complacency. As we took our political, economic, and military advantages for granted, other actors were steadily improving and implementing their long-term plans to challenge America and to advance an agenda opposed to US, our allied, and partner interests. Countries had exploited international institutions that we had helped to build, subsidized their industries, forced technology transfers, and distorted markets. These and other actions were challenging America's economic security. The NSS argued that the United States needed to take note of these challenges and to respond to these growing political, economic, and military competitions, all fueled by technology. These competitions required the United States to rethink the policies of the past 2 decades, policies which had been based on the assumption that engagement with rivals and their inclusion in international institutions and global commerce would turn them into benign actors and trustworthy partners. Often, that was not the case. The NSS noted that competition does not always mean hostility, nor does it inevitably lead to conflict, because an America that successfully competes is the best way to prevent conflict. Just as American weakness invites challenge, American strength and confidence deters war and promotes peace. So in sum, the NSS identified great power competition as a central strategic challenge facing the United States, the most important one, but not the only one. It identified China as our most challenging competitor and called China a strategic competitor, and stated that the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, was likely to harm US interests unless we changed course and competed more effectively, that its ambitions and policies would harm US interests down the line. The NSS also differentiated among powers that challenged the United States, Russia, North Korea, Iran. Categorizations are never perfect, and we can talk about this in the question and answer period, but they offer a loose way to organize and differentiate priorities and activities. The diagnosis of the challenges facing the United States was reiterated in the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which appeared about a month later, in January of 2018. As Professor Hugh Strawn has explained, strategy is a declaration of intent and an indication of the possible means to fulfill that intent. The intent of the strategy was to drive home our greatest challenge, the rise of China, and to note that it was not just a military contest. It was first and foremost an economic and technological one, because dominance in those domains had direct military and political implications. To fully understand the diagnosis of the world that was set forth in the National Security Strategy, I think it's worth clarifying some of the assumptions that undergirded the strategy to explain why we could not continue a business as usual approach. And again, I'm sure this will provide fodder for discussion and debate, which I look forward to. A first assumption was that states were not converging toward a liberal international order. The NSS argued that they were not, and by the mid-2000s, this had become clearer than we wanted to admit. China had no intention of converging with the West. The CCP never intended to play by the West's rules. It was determined to control markets rather than to open them. China had deliberately used the economic openings afforded by its entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001 and those benefits to achieve its political and economic goals. The CCP had harnessed private industry to support its military modernization through a program known as civil-military fusion. And China all the while still held and still holds its status as a developing nation. A second assumption was that globalization was not an unmitigated good. Political and business leaders had promised that globalization's rising tide would lift all boats, but this expectation had gone unfulfilled. Instead, it created winners and losers, and this had political and economic implications. As the Harvard economist Danny Roderick and others explained, blind adherence to the doctrine of borderless trade had led to hyperglobalization at the expense of domestic cohesion. This meant that globalization had privileged a set of powerful interests, creating serious cleavages among the have and the have-not, among those who were globally networked and those who were not. And China had used the interconnectedness of global markets to carefully construct its own vertical supply chains so that one day it could fully control these supply chains. And I think we're seeing that today. A third assumption was that there were limitations to multilateral institutions. The NSS called into doubt whether international institutions could transform the behavior and preferences of states. In reality, they had a limited capacity to do so, whether on climate change or improving human rights records. States and sovereignty remained important because states still held the power. They controlled the money and they controlled the resources. While the NSS argued that a range of international institutions established the rules for how states, businesses, and individuals could interact with each other, these rules were often not upheld. The NSS noted America's willingness to work through such multilateral organizations, but also wanted to ensure that they produced outcomes consistent with US interests and values and the interests and values of our allies and partners. In a sense, it was taking heed of Betts's warning in that article about goal displacement. Goal displacement, he said, meant that the standard operating procedures of complex organizations like the UN or the World Health Organization or the WTO become ends in and of themselves, meaning meetings for the sake of meetings, processes for the sake of processes, as opposed to a means of achieving strategic objectives. And I think that's an important point, and we can come back to that in the Q&A. A fourth assumption of the document was that the United States was no longer dominant militarily. Instead, we needed to return from our holiday from history, which we had enjoyed during that period of post-Cold War leadership. Now we were contested across all traditional military domains: land, sea, air, space, political, economic, technological. We could not operate freely. And finally, a final assumption that the NSS set forth was to question whether or not technologies were a force for good, whether or not they favored democracies. For close to 2 decades, the United States had hoped that digital technologies would favor democracies and the forces of freedom. To quote a US president, there had been a great hope that the age of information would become the age of liberation. That assumption, it seemed, no longer held. Now, the United States needed to get serious about technologies such as 5G, such as semiconductors, and others, in order to ensure that we remain competitive in these key domains, partly because they have political implications. Painting a picture of the world as it is not cold-hearted. Rather, by understanding the forces at play, we have a better chance of shaping the kind of world that favors free and open societies and democracies. Viewing the world as it is, not as we wish it to be, gives us a better chance of seeing the opportunities to effect real change. Now I'll turn for a moment, having described some of the key themes and assumptions of the NSS, to the process of actually crafting the document. First, to draw out some of the assumptions that I described and to discuss them, my team began with a series of about 10 PCCs, These are policy coordinating committee meetings, which are the basic working level meetings at the National Security Council. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of the interagency process. This is really the interagency process at work. Invitations are issued to representatives at different departments, the Defense Department, Commerce, the State Department, the Treasury Department, and more. Individuals from these departments come to attend these meetings to refine problems and to begin to advance policy solutions. And down the line, these sort of go up the chain to different levels of decision makers if there are disagreements. In our meetings, we included all agencies and really tried to be inclusive, and most all showed up. If several representatives from an agency wanted to come, that was fine with me as long as there was space, because obviously the State Department is a big department, as is the Defense Department. So often representatives from different subgroups within those agencies would want to attend the meetings. I learned quickly, and I learned this even earlier, that cutting people out of meetings in Washington is a surefire way to increase your enemies, and it always comes back to haunt you. So we tried to be as inclusive as we could. In a sense, these framework meetings were structured implicitly around some of the assumptions and the themes I mentioned earlier. So we had meetings on regional and country-specific issues, such as subjects such as China, Russia, the Middle East, but we also had meetings on some of the concepts: sovereignty, the future of the international order, the nature of multilateral institutions. So it was a balance between those areas, as well as functional areas as well. Deterrence was one. We were able to take down ideas, consider concerns, and gather people's inputs from the whole interagency. And again, I think this inclusive part of the process was important and was, I think, one reason why there were really no leaks of the NSS as it was being developed. And I think it was because people felt that there was buy-in into the process. Parallel to these PCC meetings, there were about 5 other lines of effort underway. That sounds like a lot, it probably is, but strategy making is not a linear process. It's usually simultaneous, especially because time is always a factor in these situations. So one line of effort was to start outlining possible structures for the document. My office worked closely with the National Security Advisor on this, and we settled on structuring the strategy around America's 4 core national security interests. These were protect the homeland, and these are still protect the homeland, promote economic prosperity, preserve peace through strength, and advance American influence. Not all previous strategy documents were structured explicitly around core national security interests. Again, as I mentioned, strategy is an art, not a science, and strategies can be constructed in different ways, and they are. We believed it was important to structure this strategy around these core national security interests. And we wanted to structure them in the context of the competitions taking place in the world so that we could describe the new actions necessary in each of these areas to achieve better outcomes for the United States. A second line of effort simultaneous to all of this was the gathering of information. We asked each directorate on the National Security Council, both the functional ones such as counterterrorism and the regional ones such as Europe and Asia, to set forth problems and opportunities in their area and to identify policy priorities and policy priority actions. What would they like to see over the next few years? What were their concerns? What was different about the previous 4 years? We really wanted their inputs to think through these different issues. These were captured in papers that each directorate delivered to my office. And as I recall, the papers were somewhere between sort of 5 and 10 pages. We didn't want to make them much longer than that because we thought they actually wouldn't get done in that case. Related to this was the drafting of country and regional and functional strategies also. The national security strategy sets out, it's an umbrella document, right? It's not that long. And we knew that sub-strategies would need to be developed for each region or functional area. And in the end, there were about 16 of these that were done. An example, which I urge you to look at, was the recently declassified Indo-Pacific strategy. It was an example of these types of sub-strategies that were developed during the course of 2018. It was declassified by the Trump White House, as he was leaving office, I think, so it was recently, I think declassified in December or January of this year. Third, we also made a concerted effort throughout this to build coalitions across the executive branch, and I hinted upon this earlier, the importance of coalitions. I'm not speaking for General McMaster, but having worked on doctrine for the rather large US Army, he knew that a critical part of the acceptance of new approaches was to brief key leaders and to gain their support along the way. So we took that example and applied it to the NSS. We met with key department secretaries and their policy aides to gain their inputs early on. Again, part of the coalition building. And this extended outward as well. Me and my team met with think tank experts. We met with allies and partners quite often. Again, I don't think this is often covered externally, but this outreach was very much appreciated. We talked to, again, our allies and partners quite often. I think they were quite surprised, but they liked it. We had good working relationships, and we appreciated it because we could hear from their inputs, consider them, and occasionally we got to enjoy a nice Italian or German snack as well once we got out of the building, which was rare. A fourth line of effort involved periodic meetings at higher levels, at the deputy secretary level, for instance. There were fewer of these because we were conscious of how many meetings we could ask deputy secretaries to take part in, right? They're really busy people dealing with crises and other issues. But we did want to ensure that we were briefing them as the document was unfolding so there wouldn't be surprises at the end. And finally, I think we're on the fifth line of effort, there was the actual drafting of the document. We began outlining each pillar. So we called the national security, the four interests that I mentioned, protect the American homeland, promote prosperity, preserve peace through strength, and advance American influence. They became known sort of in Washington parlance as the four pillars. And we started to draft each of these pillars. Simultaneously, different members of my team would take their pen at different parts of each pillar. We would also use the inputs that we received from the National Security Council directorates that I mentioned. And we worked with the interagency as well. So we would ask the State Department in terms about crafting certain language on Europe, let's say, or on NATO, let's say. So it was quite an interactive process, but nonetheless, we actually kept the electrons, right? Or in Washington speak, that means, we kept the draft as it unfolded, especially at the end. We wanted to control how many copies of the full draft were out there or the emerging pillars. In the end, when they were completed, we actually sent the executive departments of each agency, we sent their executive secretaries, it's called. They manage paper flows among departments. We sent them drafts of each of the pillars and of the whole document. We sent them in PDF format. This seems maybe esoteric, but actually the point is we did not want line in, line out edits. We made it clear that we wanted edits for thematic issues, things that were wrong, issues that needed to be emphasized further. We wanted substantive efforts. We didn't want line in and line out edits. Of course, Washington being Washington, some departments and agencies were a bit agitated by this. So they went to the trouble of turning the PDFs back into Word documents, doing their edits, and then sending it back to us as a PDF. So let me tell you that it was almost indecipherable to actually see their edits, but we did the best we could to manage their concerns and take what we could. We worked especially closely with the Defense Department because the National Defense Strategy is such an important document, and it would be odd if the DoD strategy was not aligned with the National Security Strategy. We had the support of Secretary Mattis in this. He had a much bigger team working on the National Defense Strategy. Just the nature of DoD, they always bring more to the fight, so to speak. So certainly they probably could have won out if this were a time competition. But Secretary Mattis was clear that the NSS needed to come out first and the NDS needed to follow. So they were essentially drafted in some ways simultaneously with a lot of communication between our teams. In terms of style, we wanted to make sure that the national security strategy was very clear. It was not filled with what I call Washington speak, which I define as too many adjectives and too many verbs. Too many verbs, meaning sometimes instead of using one verb, departments and agencies like to use 3 or 4 verbs in a row. So we were we edited for clarity. We didn't want to make the document too long. We wanted it to be understood by a broad swath of people, by the American people, by friends, by parents, by students, not just strategists and not just inside Washington people. I think this is important actually for a very substantive reason. Clarity is important because if critics of strategy are going to argue that democracies require compromise, that there's contentiousness, which is all true, right? That there are different factions, different people. You have to build coalitions and manage these factions. Clarity is really important if you have any hope of implementing a strategy in a democracy, because you need to persuade these constituencies about what's at stake and what actions need to be taken. So clarity is important in doing that, and in my view, has a direct link to implementation and to buy-in. Remember, the White House and the National Security Council have no real budget and no real instruments of power. Every year we have debates about how large the National Security Council is, but compared to most of government, it's actually pretty minuscule and its budget is tiny. It doesn't have implementation power, nor really does the White House. It has the pulpit of the White House, sometimes called the bully pulpit. It has executive orders, which are used by presidents to illuminate their intent. But executive orders can't really drive implementation. They signal intent to departments and agencies. And similarly, the national security strategy, as I mentioned earlier, I think it was Hugh Strawn who said, signals an intent. But departments and agencies, the Defense Department, the State Department, USAID, the Commerce Department, they have the tools, the instruments, the people, and the money to actually drive implementation. So how you build a strategy and how you communicate it has a direct impact on implementation. And what did come out of the 2017 National Security Strategy? Despite criticisms, and I think actually a pretty remarkable lack of attention in the press about what actually came out of it, there's a lot of implementation underway. 4 broad outlines of effort began by early 2018. I can't name all of the specific actions. I mean, I actually could, but that would probably take another hour and it would be very boring because it would just be a list of activities. But I can tell you that the National Security Council, by the end of 2019, had compiled, by the end of 2020, had compiled dozens of pages of specific actions. Over 18 pages, for instance, on US-China related actions that had been implemented and undertaken, and that doesn't account for the many broader areas of actions, from the Indo-Pacific to NATO to functional areas as well. But I'll offer some contours of implementation so you can look further if you're interested. First, in the political domain, implementation centered on trying to create balancing coalitions of actors. Partly this was done by formalizing the Indo-Pacific construct. So a key part of the national security strategy was to talk about Asia in terms of the Indo-Pacific, which was different than in the past. Pacific Command was renamed the Indo-Pacific Command. This wasn't an American concept. It had actually been initiated years ago by Japan, supported by India. So in many ways, it was actually a positive thing from the perspective of Japan and India to have Indo-Pacific be used as a framing term. The Quad was strengthened. The Quad includes the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. The US bilateral relationship with Japan was significantly strengthened through increased defense cooperation and political consultations. The Asian Reassurance Initiative Act of 2018 supported over $2 billion of political and economic initiatives in the Asia region. These political efforts overall, including raising awareness of the ideological competition underway, such as the CCP influence campaigns through activities of the United Front and Confucius Institutes on campuses in the United States. And university campuses were informed of these activities in a way that had been different from the past. Funding from China and the CCP had to be disclosed. While contentious sometimes, Also with Europeans, there were discussions, and eventually the European Union ended up calling China a systemic rival. President Macron of France proposed a strategic axis of France, Australia, and India. So these are examples of political coalitions that emerged that were part of the implementation of the strategy. There were also coalitions that emerged to counter China's One Belt, One Road, OBOR initiative by strengthening instruments such as the EXIM, Export-Import Bank of the United States, known as EXIM. For the first time, it received 7 years of authorization, which again sounds quite bureaucratic, but it's quite important because it means that the bank can use its assets in a more strategic way. It's rare in Washington that you get 7 years to work out a strategy or a set of policies. Usually it's much more truncated. New agencies were created, such as the Development Finance Corporation, which gives the United States new and more powerful tools to support positive investments around the world. So again, these were tools to try to counter some of the activities underway as China was building infrastructure and other types of projects and its One Belt, One Road initiative. A second line of implementation involved shaping military balance of power to defer adversaries and competitors. In addition to an overall increase in defense spending, I think over 2 years, the defense budget increased by about $100 billion. DoD prioritized the modernization of the nuclear triad. It left the INF Treaty in 2019, which meant the US would no longer be disadvantaged in the development of mid-range ballistic and cruise missiles, an area which China had been operating in for years unconstrained because it was not part of the treaty. DoD reshaped its investment priorities toward unmanned vessels, laser weapons, hypersonics, AI, artificial intelligence, and more. And it continues to make efforts, although they're mixed, to achieve faster deployments in these new capabilities. It's very hard to get DoD, ponderous as it is, to change quickly, as I'm sure Professor Mansour knows. The new Space Force was driven by very real concerns about China and the competition in space. And it was driven by the belief that the United States need to focus more resources and develop more talent to compete in this domain. Meanwhile, training and readiness for the military was reoriented to the Pacific, and the number of freedom of navigation operations in 2019 had the greatest number of them since in its 40-year history of the program. Those are sometimes known as FONOPS, F-O-N-O-P-S, the FONOPS program. So we essentially conducted more freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea than had been done in the previous 40 years in terms of numbers each year. Keep in mind that the Europeans came along as well. Again, I don't think this was often covered. In 2019, France deployed an aircraft carrier to the Indo-Pacific, accompanied by ships from the UK, Portugal, Denmark, and Italy, as well as Australia and the United States. Jim Priestap at the National Defense University has written a lot about this, and my colleague at the Hudson Institute, Lisette Odegaard, has also written about these shifts from a European perspective. A third objective in the economic domain was to implement measures to stop the exploitation of the liberal economic order. A key part of this was calling out the egregious nature of what had been taking place. Detailed reports were published by DoD, the US Trade Representative, the Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, all detailing the nature of China's IP theft and other trade barriers. And these are all publicly available reports, and they're quite detailed. A lot of information is in them, as well as recommendations, and many of those recommendations were implemented. New measures included strengthening CFIUS, which screens foreign investments in strategic companies in the United States, and the number of CFIUS cases doubled in 2017 and onward. It continues to increase each year. Other defense measures included scrutinizing early investments in small high-tech companies developing critical technologies. A lot of times, one of the DoD reports I mentioned noted that China tended to invest in these early stage companies, so it could gain access to these technologies of critical importance. Ellen Lord and others at the Defense Department created a so-called trusted capital marketplace, a network of capital, of funding that could be trusted to provide funding to these small companies, but to avoid having them be funded by China or other adversaries. The Department of Justice and the FBI worked together to increase indictments against Chinese nationals engaging in cyber and economic crimes. Visa regulations were changed to ensure compliance and to reduce the exfiltration of R&D related technology, of R&D and technology. And we saw a lot of changes in that domain. Finally, in terms of maintaining and prevailing in tech innovation, there was support for additional non-defense related spending in AI and quantum. There were increases of 30%, for instance, from 2020 to 2021. I think these kinds of increases are probably going to continue under the Biden administration, since this has been a priority of his and his team. In terms of technology, there was also a big push to put 5G on the national agenda. I would say that 5 years ago, no one would have really known, except for experts, what 5G was about. And today it's much more in the public conversation, understanding why it's so important to US tech dominance and to US national security, as well as our economic competitiveness. And many measures have been taken to try to make progress in that domain, although we have a ways to go. Much of this was captured by a term used in the national security strategy called the National Security Innovation Base. NSIB is the acronym. I felt proud to have gotten that term in the document. Felt like I'd really made it in Washington because I had an acronym that I had made up, and it actually made sense. So could all of these initiatives be faster and stronger and move more quickly? Of course they can. Government, takes time, and any significant shift takes time. But arguments that the NSS was not being implemented are factually false. In response to the document, virtually every US department, from state to DoD to Treasury to Commerce to USAID, Department of Justice, the FBI, were making and implementing new policies to address the challenges I just set forth. As the new Biden national security team takes over, they'll have dozens of pages documenting these specific measures, and I'm sure that they will build on many of them, continue them, and strengthen them. The signs are there. Most recently, at a press conference this week, the State Department spokesperson reiterated that the Biden administration views that we are in a serious strategic competition with China. Strategic competition is the frame through which we see that relationship. Again, those were words that could have been taken from the 2017 document. So looking ahead, what does some of this say about American grand strategy going forward? And this also is, where I definitely am looking forward to the conversation and to hearing from you. The 2017 strategy set a foundation for 3 propositions going forward, in my view. First, great power competition will continue to matter and will constrain future strategy making. Whatever the term of art, and academics and pundits like to debate terms and definitions and disagree about them, several features of great power competition will endure. States will remain at the core of the international system. It's states, as I noted, that have the power and resources. It's states that field military forces, that provide economic aid, and that emit carbon or take decisions to reduce the emissions of carbon. Great power competition will determine how we live domestically and internationally. The more powerful states, those that can exert influence, are those who will set the rules of the road, and we will be affected by those rules. So this is important. Great power competition will require us to have the ability to use a diverse set of statecraft tools effectively, simultaneously, and continuously at all levels. So this will continue, and it's really an imperative. Second, especially in the environment that we find ourselves, we need to remember, while that strategy is not apolitical, it's critical to make a distinction between politics and partisanship. Colin Gray, who many of you also have read or perhaps have even met, he passed away, I think just last year, observed that strategy is made and executed in a process that is always political in nature, because politics provides the enabling mechanism for community action. I'll read that again. Politics provides the enabling mechanism for community action. That is akin to Betts's point about the difficulty of strategy in a democracy, where elections matter and where new political leaders have different views about the US role in the world. But achieving outcomes for our nation will always be greater and more meaningful than achieving short-term gains for a party. If our decision-making is dominated by partisanship, that means we start from scratch over and over. And if we're constantly starting over, we won't build upon successes and we will lose our ground to our competitors that can sustain their strategies over time because they don't have to deal with the tumult and the fractiousness of democracies. If we can achieve a degree of consensus about the nature of the challenges we face, we will be able to build on our accomplishments over time. And this is especially relevant in democracies where changes are incremental and just slow. Let's hope then that we can focus on achieving the objectives that deliver the greatest benefits to the United States and our partners and our allies, and apply our best thinking to those policies that will allow us to achieve those ends. And third, my final point in looking ahead is that we might keep in mind Richard Betts's warning about what he called the tyranny of unintended consequences, or blowback, or the non-linearity of human affairs. What he meant by that was that, again, strategy is not a science, it's an art. It's complicated, it's messy. Critics point to this and say that strategy is an illusion. But hopefully, as I've tried to point out in the talk, really what it means is that strategy needs to adopt constantly. We will always have risks of unintended consequences, but that doesn't mean that we should have inaction. With strategy, there's always a push and pull between dynamic and adaptive adversaries. While our bureaucratic system drives us to think that foreign policy can and should have clear endpoints, geopolitics never truly ends, right? Part of our system drives us to what is our end state, but in reality, strategy forces us to continuously adapt and respond because our adversaries and competitors have responses. Henry Kissinger has written that conflict is not artificial, though many persist in thinking that. The liberal order has not succeeded in tempering the competition that is inherent in world politics and enduring. And as an aside, Dr. Kissinger did stop in from time to time, which is kind of a fun and obviously exciting part of being at the National Security Council. Conflict is an outcome of fundamental differences of interests. And if we want to preserve our liberty and our welfare, we have to accept it as a reality to deal with, not hope that we can avoid it completely. The historian and strategist Michael Howard observed that peace is not a static state of affairs. Often it is a more complex affair than war. He was right to see that peacetime geopolitical competition requires constant attention. And that is why we need strategists. And that is why we need the next generation of strategists like those of you. So thank you very much. And I look forward to any questions you may have.